Hello, welcome to ICMR NI's online course on causal inference from observational studies, NICER 201, in short, CAUSIT. This session, we'll talk about effect measure modification. The session is divided into three parts. In the first part, I'll talk to you about what effect measure modification is. In the second session, I'll tell you how to identify effect measure modification in an epidemiological study and how to report it. And finally, in the third session, I'll summarize how to address third factors, that is confounding and effect measure modification. Let us start with the first session on what is effect measure modification. We say that in any epidemiological study, specifically the analytical epidemiological studies, wherein we are trying to find the effect of an exposure on an outcome, there exists an effect measure modification when an exposure's effect on the outcome differs in different subgroups of the study population, which means that different groups of, if we divided our study population into different groups by certain characteristics and then estimated the measure of effect or the odds ratio or the risk ratio or the rate ratio depending on the study design in each of these groups. If we find that these are different, then we say that the effect of the exposure on the outcome has been modified by this particular characteristic based on which we would have divided our study population into different groups. Now, how do we spot or identify that there is effect measure modification happening in our study? We can say that effect measure modification occurs when the answer to the question on the measure of association is, it depends on the presence or absence of this third factor or modifier in the study. For example, if we wanted to estimate the efficacy of, say, measles vaccine in children, we would see that the efficacy of the vaccine actually differs or varies according to the age of the children. The efficacy is higher in a certain age group and the efficacy is lower in another age group. And hence, the effect of the measles vaccine on the occurrence or preventing measles depends on the age of the vaccine recipient. And hence, age would then be called as an effect measure modifier or an effect modifier in short. Another example, if we are trying to look at the risk of myocardial infarction among women taking oral contraceptives, again, this risk may differ depending on whether the women are smokers or not. And it has been seen that the risk of MI due to oral contraceptives is actually higher among women who are smokers compared to those who are non-smokers. And hence, we would label smoking as a modifier of the effect of oral contraceptives on the risk of myocardial infarction among women. Statistically, you might have also heard of the term interaction. So what's the relationship between this effect measure modification and interaction or statistical interaction? In reality, they are actually measuring the same phenomenon, wherein the effect measure modification is basically a heterogeneity in the measure of the effect on the outcome D across different levels of another covariate or a third factor. Similarly, statistical interaction is the heterogeneity of the measure of this exposure outcome association across different levels of another third factor or covariate in the same source population. In fact, we can make inferences about effect measure modification by using the outcome of statistical interactions. Now you may be asking, why do we call it effect measure modification? Just to dwell more on this terminology of effect measure modification, we understand that this third factor is modifying the effect of the exposure on the outcome. Now, what is it actually modifying? That would depend on what is the measure of association that we are utilizing in our study. Are we using risk difference as a measure to say that the risk difference changes with the change in the presence or absence of the modifier, or the risk ratio changes with the presence or absence of this modifier? In reality, what would happen is that if we calculate both the risk difference as well as the risk ratio from the same study for different strata of this modifier, we would see that whenever the risk difference if the risk difference changes, the risk ratio would remain constant. And if the risk ratio changes, risk difference would remain constant. And hence, it is important to distinguish which measure of association is being modified due to the presence of this particular modifier or third factor. In the example that you see here on the slide, we want to estimate the effect of a particular exposure on the disease incidence. Here, we are considering age as a potential modifier. If you see in the first graph, in the top graph, the disease incidence by exposure and age, you can see that there is a constant difference of incidence with age. What that means is, for example, if you see at the first age group 1, in the unexposed, the disease incidence is 2, and the disease incidence in the exposed is 4. So the risk difference is 4 minus 2, which is 2. In the second stratum of age, or the second subgroup of age, the risk in the unexposed is 4, and the risk in the exposed is 6. And again, the difference is 2. And same way it goes for the third age group, for the fourth age group, and the fifth age group. However, if you look at the risk ratio keeps on changing. And in the first instance, it's 4 by 2, which is 2. In the second instance, it's 6 by 4, which is less than 2. And so with the increase in the age group, the risk ratio is decreasing from 2 to 1.2. Whereas if you look at the graph below, the risk ratio remains constant across different age groups, while the risk difference actually increases from 2 in the age group 1 to 10 in the age group 2. What we're trying to say here is that because of its mathematical property, if the risk difference remains the same, the risk ratio will change across different stratum or subgroups of a modifier. And if the risk ratio remains the same, the risk difference will change. And hence, it is important to specify which measure of association are we saying that gets modified because of the presence of this particular modifier. And hence, instead of using the word effect modifier, it is more suitable to say effect measure modifier or effect modifier of risk difference or effect modifier of risk ratio. In the next session, we'll look at how to identify and report this phenomenon of effect measure modification. Thank you.